And we've got the power panel standing by to break down everything that happened on the campaign trail today and what's about to happen with the president. But while we wait for Donald Trump, we're going to begin with some reporting from our colleagues at Radio-Canada. They found that during Mark Carney's time as Brookfield Asset Management chair, the Liberal leader co-chaired 2 investment funds, both registered in the tax haven of Bermuda. Radio-Canada's Daniel Leblanc joins me now. He broke this story today. So Daniel, tell us more about what you found out about these investment funds and what Mark Carney had to say about it today.
Yeah, so Mark Carney was the head of Brookfield Asset Management from 2020 to 2025. And during that time, he created a few investment funds, all in the kind of realm of the green economy, sustainable development, net zero, carbon reduction companies, and these investments were worldwide. The assets or the fund raised $25 billion, according to the Brookfield press releases. And the way the funds were set up, and it's always complicated. I spoke to corporate lawyers. You know, there's always entities here and there in Ontario, but also in Bermuda. And that was a way for companies to invest in the funds. And obviously, Bermuda is a tax haven, and that allows the investors to pay lower amounts of taxes on their profits. If you're a Canadian investor, you do end up paying taxes on the profits in Canada, but not all investors in those funds were Canadian, and thus there's an obvious tax advantage for some investors to do business in Bermuda where there's no corporate tax rate. Mark Carney was asked about this on the campaign trail today. His answers were in reference mostly to Canadian investors, but you know, the funds are not entirely transparent, and so we don't know exactly who invested, how they paid taxes, and all that. And he sought to basically reassure Canadians about the property. No one's alleging that there was anything illegal here, but he's saying this was actually good business. So we can listen to Mark Carney today.
The flow through of the funds go to Canadian entities who then pay the taxes appropriately, as opposed to taxes being paid multiple times before they get theirs.
But is it avoiding tax in any way?
It doesn't avoid tax because the tax is paid in, for example, the examples all I gave, the taxes are paid in Canada. Yeah.
And so Mark Carney was saying, you know, as Prime Minister, I know how the real world works in the private sector, and as Prime Minister, I would be in a good position to basically, you know, foster Canadian policy to make sure that Canadian taxpayers are not, you know, pay their taxes, but also that corporations as well pay their taxes.
Okay, just to make sure I'm understanding the money flow, they set up this fund in Bermuda because of the tax haven status that it has. Brings investment in from around the world, but when the Canadian entities pull out their profit or draw their pension income, they then pay the tax on it in Canada. It's just where the other companies draw it out is up to them. That's how it works, as I understand it.
Yeah, that's my understanding, and that's, you know, the Liberals didn't want to answer questions about this. Brookfield also didn't really answer questions, but obviously I spoke to experts, people who know these funds. You know, where you are, you know, there are different advantages for some people, Bermuda is a clear advantage to them.
Right. So, look, obviously his political rivals are looking for any opportunity to pounce on a vulnerability with Mark Carney. So what's the reaction been to this?
Well, I mean, you know, there is a sense amongst the other parties that, you know, one of his vulnerabilities is his time in the private sector, but also his personal assets, whether he's got conflicts of interest. And that, once again, is not very transparent. He's set up a blind trust. He was asked about it. And, you know, all parties are trying to kind of weaken Mr. Carney on that front, basically raise questions about whether or not Canadians can have confidence in him as a long-term Prime Minister. So we can listen to some of the opposition attacks today.
Now, he claims that somehow this money gets funneled through a Bermuda tax haven only to come back to Canada. Well, why wouldn't he just leave it in Canada in the first place?
That's worrisome.
I think all this questions who he's in it for. Is he really in it for you, or is he in it for the super rich?
You know, I think we can all remember Paul Martin was hit about, you know, took a lot of hits over the fact his shipping company had some involvement in tax havens. You know, it's one of those questions that kind of raises anger amongst many Canadians. This is tax season. Everyone knows how much tax they pay. There's a bit of a sense that, you know, the ultra-rich or the billionaires or multinationals are avoiding paying their taxes. You know, I think it's kind of still early days in this election, but it is one of these issues that I think will keep popping up here and there during this campaign.
Daniel Leblanc with Radio Canada. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
Okay, this is where we're going to begin today with the Power Panel. Standing by, we've got Amanda Alvaro, who is a former Liberal Party communications strategist and co-host of the Beyond a Ballot podcast. And here with me at the big table, Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties. Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist. And Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of The Hill Times. Good to see you all. This conversation could be interrupted at any moment by the President of the United States, which feels like a basic waiver we're going to have to put on every conversation in this campaign. Tim, I want to start with you on this. Anything to do with Mark Carney's business past has become the focus of the Conservative and NDP attacks. This report today that green funds he set up were headquartered in Bermuda, but like Canadian pension funds were invested in them. Scandal, not a scandal, problem, not a problem. How do you view this issue?
It's probably an opportunity for the NDP. I don't think on the surface it's a scandal. He was in a position at Brookfield Asset Management to make money for his shareholders, which he's supposed to do. But I think the NDP in particular could benefit from this by making the argument more compellingly than others, maybe that Mark Carney is not in it for you, he's in it for elites. And I think Mr. Singh said that to a certain degree today. If you really want to get at the bigger challenge, it's the one they're all talking around but not addressing. It's the reason you go to Bermuda and other places to put your money in is because the Canadian tax code is such a frigging mess. But that's not an election winning issue for people to get into and out of. But it will be used by the opponents of Mark Carney to say he's out of touch and the like. I think he had a reasonable response by pointing to OMERS and Castapo, to
Ontario teachers, I think,
and all of that. But there is, I mean, Daniel's point is fair. There is people filing taxes now up until the end of April, thinking, all right, well, there's a break for people if you have money, but if you don't have money, you don't know how to get the break. So people will, it's an issue of a perception of fairness that will be exploited to the benefit of those who would like to.
You know, Jordan, some of those people filing taxes up until the end of April could be retired people relying on pension income from their OMERS pension plan, from the castle. I mean, is a criticism of offshoring. The banks I have my RRSPs with do this. So why is it a problem for Mark Carney if it's not a problem for the big banks in Canada?
Well, it's a problem for Mark Carney because it reminds Canadians that he spent his career making money for billionaires and for big businesses and doing it in ways that most Canadians don't have access to. And so whether or not there's a factual basis for tax evasion here, I'm sure there's lots of war rooms digging into that. But it is a business practice that most Canadians don't have access to save on their tax bill. And so it underlines that his experience and his connections are ones that are not shared by a lot of regular working people. And I think that that's really the problem that he has. And the other issue for him politically in this story is that his history with Brookfield is like a bottomless well of stories like this, because there are so many things that Brookfield owns and there are so many companies involved in all kinds of behavior that, yes, while it may be typical business behavior, can actually be quite predatory and is part of a financial system that a lot of Canadians feel is not really working very well for them right now. So I think Tim is right. The NDP is going to be able to make some hay out of this, and they're going to be able to make hay not just out of this story, but out of others like it over the course of the campaign.
So Amanda, the two things that have changed the political dynamic in Canada is, well, it's kind of three things. The departure of Justin Trudeau, the dominance of Donald Trump, and then the emergence of Mark Carney. And the reputation of Mark Carney seems to be the one thing the opposition parties can change, right? So this is what they're trying to do here. So how do you push back against this if you're a Liberal? Because they would argue this business past is his greatest selling point in this time. And it looks like it is the thing that the opposition sees as the biggest vulnerability for him.
Well, I think for a long time, and even on this panel, we've talked about how hard it is to attract, really the best and the brightest into the public sector. And then we get one, we get someone who has an incredible resume, and we don't have to go through all of his credentials, but they're vast credentials. These are big, big resumes. And when you have a big, big resume, there's a lot to scrutinize because you're bringing all of that invaluable credential and experience with you. And you contrast that to somebody like Poilievre, whose credentials and resume is quite short because all of his work has been in the House of Commons. But I would argue, and I would argue it really strongly, the fact that somebody said, is it a vulnerability that he comes from the private sector? Like, are we for real? We're talking about, is this like actually a conversation that we're having? We're talking about the greatest threat, the greatest generational threat that we've had. We're talking about real negotiations that have to be had, substantive discussions, serious negotiations. Who's the person that you want at that table? Somebody who's actually negotiated deals in their past, somebody who's an economist, who has that, financial credential, or somebody who hasn't. And I think it's very clear. And then just the last point I'll make is on the matter of the funds and the argument that the NDP is making. I mean, these funds were also set up to benefit Canadian pension funds. And I know a lot of teachers, but a lot of them wouldn't call themselves billionaires or millionaires. So I think that it's unfair to say that, these funds are only benefiting the ultra wealthy. It's a small point, but I think it is a point that's very difficult for the NDP to make effectively.
Cheryl, how do you see this? Because whether you like this or not, because this sort of corporate practice is described as tax avoidance, maybe more than tax evasion, to use the proper term. And, the blind trust issue about disclosure of assets, full compliance with Canadian law, but still that standard is not good enough for the critics. I mean, how do you see the way this is all playing out at this point of the campaign?
Well, it really just speaks to Mark Carney's greenness in politics. I mean, the fact that either they didn't see these things coming, they didn't have really well-prepared lines. I mean, Tim, you said he had a decent answer, but I don't know if he really did. Because essentially what it boils down to was, I've been in this world, I know how this works, just trust me. And that's a lot to ask from people. The general, we're talking about politics and the general electorate, and they are going to get, their backs up or their eyebrows raised when they hear things about taxes and when they hear things about avoidance or offshore accounts or Bermuda or all of those types of things. And they go, oh, hey, wait a minute, I can't do that. Why do you get to do that? Or you've been in, and so it's really interesting to see how the messaging is and his he takes a few days, it seems, before he can land on something really strong and really stellar in terms of a response. So even if, as we've seen before, yes, you're following the rules, you're going by the letter of the law, if not the spirit, and all those things, like you need to have a quicker response to this because the campaign moves quickly.
But help me understand this, and I'm trying to understand, why isn't it's in full compliance with the law a good enough answer?
Exactly.
This is like, Tim, help me with this. Like, why isn't it? What is it that makes that unacceptable in 2025?
Well, I think it gets to something both Amanda and Cheryl were talking about. There's still this anti-elite element that is out there. Pierre Poilievre did really well exploiting that prior to Donald Trump emerging, prior to Justin Trudeau stepping down. He was able in an exceptionally well mannered way to tag Justin Trudeau as an out-of-touch elite. So they're going with the same approach here. So if that is what you're trying to do to your opponent, then you could have all of your papers strewn across the desk right now and you could read them line by line and it wouldn't do. So the politics of this is still trying to push the button and see how far you can get with Mark Carney on this, because it worked.
I get the tactic. I get the tactical frame and the politics of it, but like, why isn't this is legal? I've complied with what's expected of me. Why isn't that the standard right now?
Well, because I think people no longer have complete trust that the standards are adequate to get at the reality of what is behind what people are doing. And that's an issue of confidence in democratic institutions. And I think that there's also, to some degree rightly, a perception that those who are very wealthy and have more money and have more resources at their disposal to have the best accountants are able to move money around in a way that's opaque to regular people. And so the fact that when Mark Carney, for example, came to talk about his own assets and putting them in a blind trust, yes. Did he comply with what the rules are? Absolutely. But is it the minimum? Yes. He didn't choose to.
Well, he came in early. It wasn't the minimum. He did apply early, right?
But he complied. He did the minimum a little early. But I would say that from a political perspective, when you know that your own assets, your own financial history, the fact that you're a multimillionaire, that you might still be profiting from some of these companies, when that's on the table, politically, it's also smart to do a little bit more than the minimum to head it off at the pass.
So, Amanda, on that, Liberals can complain this isn't a fair standard, but I remember talking to Howard Dean as things were going south with Joe Biden. He said, politics isn't fair. Just get over it and deal with it. So how does Mark Carney get over it and deal with it? Or does he have to?
Well, I think that he does what he's been doing, and I take issue actually with Sherelle's response in particular as a nonpartisan on the panel, because his response today was not what she said. His response was that there's a flow through of the funds that goes to Canadian entities who pay those taxes appropriately. That was his actual answer. You may not like the answer, you may not understand the answer, but that's still an answer. And I think it's really important that because there's a sowing of so much distrust or mistrust in our politicians, I think it's really important that we actually share the facts, ma'am. And in this case, he can only provide the facts. He can give the information when he's asked the question. But because we have this instinct or this temptation, particularly from the Conservative Party, to sow this feeling of distrust, this is the problem.